Ever imagine giving birth without painkillers? What if the person helping you had no medical training? Could you survive childbirth when a simple infection meant certain death? Number 5. The Deathbed Gamble. Did you know that medieval women often prepared for death before giving birth? It's a chilling truth that haunts our understanding of medieval motherhood. For women in the Middle Ages, pregnancy wasn't just a time of anticipation. It was potentially a death sentence. In medieval times, a pregnant woman would typically make her will and confession before going into labor. This wasn't mere superstition, it was a pragmatic response to the grim statistics they faced. Estimates suggest that for every 100 births, 1 to 5 women would die from childbirth-related causes. While these numbers might not seem overwhelming to modern readers, they represented a terrifying reality for medieval women. Imagine entering each pregnancy knowing there was a significant chance you wouldn't survive to raise your child. The preparation for potential death wasn't limited to practical arrangements. Women would pray to Saint Margaret, the patron saint of pregnant women and childbirth, hoping for divine intervention when human help would likely prove insufficient. They would clutch special birthing girdles, strips of parchment or actual belts inscribed with prayers and charms that were believed to ease labor pains and ensure survival. What made childbirth so dangerous? Primarily, 3 killers stalked the birthing chamber: hemorrhage, infection, and obstructed labor. Without modern medicine's ability to stop bleeding, administer antibiotics, or perform safe cesarean sections, these complications were often fatal. A woman who began hemorrhaging after delivery could bleed to death within hours, while attendants watched helplessly. Infections, now easily treated with antibiotics, would slowly poison a woman's system in the days following birth. And an obstructed labor where the baby couldn't pass through the birth canal usually resulted in the death of both mother and child after days of excruciating fruitless labor. The desperate fear surrounding childbirth permeated medieval culture. Surviving manuscripts and diaries reveal prayers specifically asking not for a healthy baby as modern parents might, but for the mother's survival. "Let me live to see my child's face," was a common sentiment, reflecting the priority placed simply on maternal survival rather than the idealized birthing experience many expect today. Number 4. The birthing chamber. No men allowed. Would you trust your life to a room full of women with no formal medical training? Medieval women had no choice. The medieval birthing chamber was exclusively female territory. Men, even physician husbands, were strictly prohibited. This wasn't just cultural preference, it was enforced social segregation that shaped how women experienced childbirth. The birthing room became a rare space of female authority in a patriarchal world. But this separation came with serious consequences for maternal care. When a woman went into labor, she retreated to a specially prepared room with darkened windows. The medieval belief system treated birth not just as a medical event, but as a mysterious, almost supernatural process that required specific environmental conditions. The darkened room supposedly eased the transition of the baby from the dark womb to the outside world, while also providing privacy in a time when modesty was paramount. The birth attendants consisted of a midwife and several female relatives or neighbors. The midwife, contrary to popular belief, rarely had formal training. Her knowledge came from personal experience and apprenticeship with older midwives. She learned by watching, assisting, and then eventually leading deliveries herself. Some midwives became highly skilled through this practical education, but many had only rudimentary understanding of anatomy and complications. These female-only birthing chambers created a supportive sisterhood during labor, but also meant that new medical knowledge developing slowly in male-dominated university settings rarely reached the practitioners who actually delivered babies. While male physicians studied ancient texts by Hippocrates and Galen, this theoretical knowledge rarely benefited laboring women since these physicians weren't present during births. The separation created two parallel worlds of medical knowledge, male theoretical medicine and female practical midwifery, that rarely intersected to improve maternal care. The birthing room equipment reveals the limited resources available. A birthing stool, a chair with a crescent-shaped hole in the seat, was the centerpiece. Women delivered in a sitting or squatting position, using gravity to assist the birth. Attendants brought linen cloths, herbal preparations, crude tools for emergencies, and various charms and amulets believed to protect mother and child. Heat was considered essential, so even in summer fires blazed in the birthing chamber, making the rooms stifling, but aligned with the belief that warmth prevented dangerous cold from entering the mother's body. This female-centered approach had advantages. Women supported each other through an intensely vulnerable experience with empathy that male physicians might have lacked. However, the strict gender segregation meant that when serious complications arose, the most educated medical practitioners of the time, university-trained physicians, weren't present to help, even if their limited knowledge might occasionally have made a difference. Number 3. Pain relief, herbs, prayers, and suffering. How much pain could you endure with nothing but herbs and prayers to help you? Medieval women faced childbirth with almost no effective pain management. The medieval approach to labor pain stands in stark contrast to modern epidurals and medical pain relief. For women giving birth in the Middle Ages, pain wasn't just an unfortunate side effect. It was considered a spiritual necessity, divinely ordained punishment for Eve's original sin. This theological understanding meant that alleviating birth pain wasn't just medically challenging. It was sometimes viewed as morally questionable. Despite these religious constraints, midwives and women developed various methods to ease suffering during childbirth. Herbal remedies formed the cornerstone of medieval pain management. Ergot, derived from a fungus that grows on rye, could strengthen contractions, but carried serious risks of uterine rupture and poisoning. Willow bark, containing compounds similar to modern aspirin, offered mild pain relief. Other common preparations included mixtures of vervain, birthwort, and mugwort, often brewed into teas or applied as poultices. Some herbs used during medieval labor would raise eyebrows today. Mandrake root, now known to contain hallucinogenic and narcotic alkaloids, was sometimes used to induce a semi-delirious state that distanced women from pain. The plant was so valuable that specialized instructions existed for harvesting it, including plugging one's ears to avoid hearing the plant's mythical deadly scream when uprooted. Beyond herbs, physical comfort measures helped women cope with labor pain. Hot cloths, applied to the abdomen and back, provided relief similar to modern heating pads. Massage techniques passed down through generations of midwives helped ease back labor and encourage proper fetal positioning. Some regions practiced specific labor positions thought to ease pain, such as sitting on another woman's lap or hanging from a cloth tied to a ceiling beam during contractions. Perhaps most significant were the psychological and spiritual pain management techniques. Birth attendants would recite specific prayers and chants believed to protect the mother. Objects considered to have spiritual power, like birth girdles, supposedly worn by the Virgin Mary during her labor, were placed on the mother's body. While modern medicine might dismiss these as placebo effects, the psychological comfort they provided was real and valuable in a time when physical pain relief options were limited. Alcohol played a complicated role in medieval labor. Strong ale or wine was sometimes given to women in labor, not primarily for pain relief, but to provide calories and energy for the intense physical work of childbirth. The mild sedative effect was a secondary benefit. However, midwives understood intuitively what modern obstetrics confirms. Excessive alcohol could slow contractions and endanger the baby. For all these methods, the stark reality remains that medieval women endured levels of pain during childbirth that modern women in developed countries rarely experience. The physical and psychological toll of this suffering can hardly be overstated. Some historical accounts describe women begging for death during particularly difficult labors, a testament to the extreme nature of unmedicated childbirth complication. Number 2. When things went wrong. Medieval obstetric nightmares. Could you survive if your baby couldn't fit through your pelvis? What happened when medieval births went catastrophically wrong? When complications arose during medieval childbirth, the situation quickly became a life or death struggle with primitive tools and limited options. Without modern surgical techniques, imaging technology, or antibiotics, obstructed labor and other complications created scenarios almost unimaginable to contemporary parents. Perhaps the most dreaded complication was an obstructed birth, where the baby became physically unable to pass through the mother's pelvis. This could happen due to the baby's position, unusual size, or the mother's pelvic structure. In modern hospitals, this situation typically leads to an emergency cesarean section. In medieval times, it frequently led to death, often of both mother and child, after days of agonizing, unproductive labor. Medieval midwives weren't completely helpless when facing complications. They developed techniques to turn babies in the womb using external manipulation similar to modern external cephalic version. Experienced midwives could sometimes detect and correct breech presentations, where the baby comes feet or buttocks first. Through skilled physical manipulation, these techniques, passed down through generations of women, occasionally saved lives, but remain dangerous improvisations compared to modern obstetric interventions. For truly desperate situations, midwives had access to horrifying tools designed for dismemberment and extraction. These included hooks, crochets, and primitive forceps used to extract a dead fetus piece by piece to save the mother's life. These procedures, performed without anesthesia on a fully conscious woman, represented the most traumatic extremes of medieval obstetric care. Historical records describe women enduring these procedures, sometimes surviving physically, but suffering profound psychological and spiritual trauma. Caesarean sections existed in medieval times, but almost exclusively as post-mortem procedures. If a mother died during labor, attendants might cut open her abdomen in a desperate attempt to extract and baptize a potentially living child before it too perished. The rare accounts of living women surviving caesarean births were so unusual they took on mythical status. Without anesthesia, antibiotics, or proper surgical techniques, a caesarean performed on a living woman was essentially a death sentence until the late 19th century. Hemorrhage after birth represented another deadly complication. Medieval midwives attempted to control bleeding using herbal preparations with astringent properties, like shepherd's purse or nettles, which contain compounds that can help blood clotting. Physical techniques included uterine massage and compression, sometimes achieved by placing heavy objects on the woman's abdomen. In severe cases, primitive internal packing with cloth was attempted, often introducing the infections that would later kill the mother even if bleeding was temporarily controlled. Medieval birth complications highlight the profound vulnerability of women in pre-modern societies. Their survival often depended entirely on the practical knowledge of their midwife and the strength of their own constitution. While modern women might fear the pain of childbirth, medieval women faced the very real possibility that this natural process would become their execution. Number 1. Surviving childbed fever. The invisible killer. What if the real danger came after your baby was safely delivered? How would you feel watching women die mysteriously one after another, from an invisible enemy. Perhaps the cruelest aspect of medieval childbirth was that even women who successfully delivered healthy babies often died days later from childbed fever, what we now know as puerperal sepsis, or postpartum infection. This bacterial infection of the reproductive tract claimed countless lives in an era before germ-free antibiotics or even basic hygiene practices. The tragedy of childbed fever lay in its timing. A woman might endure labor, successfully deliver her baby, begin recovery, and bonding with her infant only to develop fever, severe abdominal pain, and eventually succumb to overwhelming infection days later. Historical records describe new mothers feeling well enough to celebrate their deliveries before rapidly deteriorating as bacteria spread through their bodies. The psychological impact on families and communities watching new mothers die this way must have been devastating, especially since no one understood the true cause. What made childbed fever particularly insidious was its invisible transmission. Without understanding bacteria, medieval birth, attendants unknowingly spread infection between women through unwashed hands and contaminated instruments. In some communities, certain midwives became associated with higher death rates, creating fear and superstition around specific practitioners who might have simply had different hygiene practices than their peers. Medieval attempts to treat childbed fever reflect the period's limited understanding of infection. Women with developing infections might be treated with warming herbs like cinnamon or cardamom, based on the humoral medicine belief that cold entering the womb caused fever. Poultices and plasters applied to the abdomen attempted to draw out bad humors, but did nothing to stop the bacterial spread. Some herbal remedies, like garlic, did contain natural antibacterial properties, but their limited efficacy against systemic infection meant they rarely saved women with established sepsis. The religious interpretation of childbed fever added another dimension to women's suffering. In a society that viewed disease as potential divine punishment, women developing fever after childbirth might question whether they had sinned in some way to deserve this fate. Priests brought last rites rather than doctors bringing antibiotics, and dying mothers focused on spiritual preparation rather than medical intervention. Archaeological evidence provides sobering confirmation of childbed fever's toll. Examination of female medieval skeletons shows that many women of reproductive age display signs of infection and inflammation in their pelvic bones, silent testimony to the bacterial infections that likely claimed their lives. These physical remains, combined with written records, paint a picture of motherhood in the Middle Ages as not just a natural life stage, but a potentially lethal undertaking. The story of childbed fever contains a particularly tragic footnote. Unlike some other childbirth complications that remained mysterious until modern medicine, the solution to childbed fever, basic hand washing, was theoretically achievable even in medieval times. Had the connection between unclean hands and infection been understood, countless women might have been saved with the simplest of interventions. This makes the centuries of preventable deaths all the more poignant from our modern perspective. Would you risk your life to have a child? Could you hand down your most treasured possessions, make your final confession, and walk into a darkened room knowing you might never walk out? The medieval women who populated our family trees did exactly that generation after generation, facing childbirth with a courage most of us will fortunately never need to suffer.